It was supposed to be just a quick getaway. A weekend escape from the chaos of city life. I'd been working non-stop, and I needed peace. So, when I found this Airbnb listing in a remote area of North Carolina, it seemed like the perfect place. The reviews were glowing, 5 stars across the board, and the photos? Stunning. A beautiful cottage, tucked away in the woods, surrounded by tall trees and lush greenery. It looked like the kind of place I could unwind. The host, a woman named Veronica, seemed nice enough through the messages we exchanged. She provided clear directions, and even though the place was far out, I was looking forward to the solitude. No neighbors for miles, she assured me. Just nature. I arrived late in the evening. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the woods surrounding the cottage were thick with shadows. My phone GPS had a hard time finding the exact location, but I eventually stumbled upon the driveway, a narrow, overgrown path that led deeper into the forest. The house loomed ahead, dimly lit, its outline barely visible in the fading light. I parked my car and grabbed my bags. The silence was overwhelming. Not a single sound, no birds, no rustling of leaves, nothing. Just eerie stillness. I texted Veronica to let her know I'd arrived. She responded almost immediately, "Welcome. The key is under the mat. Make yourself at home." I was a little uneasy, but I brushed it off. It was late, I was tired, and the thought of a warm bed called to me. I stepped up to the porch, bent down, and found the key. As I entered, the smell of old wood and dust hit me. The cottage was charming, old-fashioned furniture, a large stone fireplace, and cozy decor. But something felt off. I couldn't place it. Maybe it was the silence, or the way the shadows seemed to move just a little too quickly. I settled into the living room and unpacked. I had been on the road for hours, and I needed to unwind. I sat on the couch, flipping through the channels on the TV. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Around midnight, I heard something. A soft creak, coming from upstairs. I froze. Maybe it was just the house settling, old places tend to do that. But then, it happened again. The sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor above me. My heart began to race. I grabbed my phone and texted Veronica. "Hey, everything okay up there? I keep hearing footsteps." She replied almost immediately, "It's just the house. Don't worry, you're safe. Relax and enjoy your stay." But I couldn't relax. My thoughts raced. The air felt thick with tension. I checked the locks on the door, double-checked the windows, and slowly made my way upstairs to the bedroom. I tried to convince myself that I was being paranoid, but the sensation of someone, or something, watching me never left. The footsteps grew louder as I reached the top of the stairs. I turned the corner and froze. The bedroom door was wide open, and in the dim light, I could swear I saw a shadow move. I was too scared to go inside. I pulled out my phone again, but before I could dial, the screen flickered, and then, it went black. I stared at the dead screen in my hands, my pulse hammering in my chest. Then, just as I turned to leave, I heard a voice. "Don't go." It was faint, barely a whisper, but it was clear. Someone was in the house with me. My blood ran cold. The voice, it wasn't Veronica. It wasn't anyone I recognized. I stood frozen, staring at the dark hallway that stretched ahead of me. The air felt heavy, suffocating almost, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. My hand still gripped the phone, but it was useless now. I couldn't call anyone. My mind raced through 100 possibilities. Robber? Another guest? A prank? But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I slowly turned around and tiptoed back to the staircase. Every floorboard creaked beneath my feet as I descended. I could still hear the whisper echoing in my mind, "Don't go." But what did it mean? Was someone trying to warn me, or was it just my imagination running wild in the dead of night? I made my way back to the living room. The silence was maddening. The old grandfather clock in the corner ticked steadily, but it only seemed to amplify the unease creeping up my spine. I locked the door, pulled the curtains closed, and huddled on the couch. I tried to turn on the TV again to distract myself, but the screen remained black. The power had cut out. I pulled the blanket tightly around me, trying to stay warm in the thickening chill of the cottage. I must have dozed off because the next thing I remember, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of the front door creaking open. I shot upright. My mind was still foggy, trying to grasp what was happening. Was Veronica here? Could she have left the door unlocked for some reason? I slowly crept towards the door, heart in my throat, and peeked through the small gap between the curtains. Nothing. But then, a figure appeared at the edge of the porch. A tall, gaunt man, standing completely still, staring directly at the door. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He wore a faded flannel shirt, and his hair hung in tangled strands, barely visible under the porch light. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body was frozen in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from him. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there. I grabbed my phone, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could reach Veronica. But the screen remained blank. Dead. Nothing worked. The phone was useless. I backed away from the door, my thoughts racing. I needed to get out of there. I needed to leave, but the man was right outside. I could feel my pulse quicken as panic set in. There was no way out of this cottage without getting close to him. I checked the windows, but the thick curtains and shadows made it impossible to see anything clearly. And then, I heard it again, the whisper. "Don't go." I whipped around, but no one was there. I stood there, trembling, unsure of what to do. The man outside was still there, unmoving, as though he were waiting for something. Waiting for me. Suddenly, the power came back on. The lights flickered for a moment, then illuminated the entire room. It felt like the whole house had just woken up. The sudden brightness felt like a jolt to my system, but it didn't make the fear go away. I peeked through the window again. The man was gone. I quickly darted to the door, checking every lock again. Something told me I needed to leave, now. I grabbed my bag, stuffed a few essentials inside, and cautiously opened the door to the porch. The air outside was freezing, cutting through my jacket like knives. But when I stepped onto the porch, I froze. The ground around the house, the trees, everything was completely still. Not a sound. Not a movement. I couldn't even hear the wind rustling through the leaves. I ran back inside, locking the door behind me. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled back into the living room. I glanced at the clock. It was 2:30 a.m. It felt like hours had passed, but it had only been a few minutes. I wasn't sure what was worse, the man standing outside, or the fact that he'd disappeared without a trace. What did he want? And why was he out there? More importantly, why did I feel like he wasn't the only thing waiting for me? I took one last look around the cottage. The strange feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. In fact, it had only grown stronger. The whispers. "Don't go." But I had no choice. I was already trapped. I thought about leaving, but where could I go? It was the middle of nowhere. The nearest town was a good 30 minutes away, and with the thick woods surrounding me, I felt like I would only get more lost. I could call someone for help, but my phone was still dead. There was no signal. No service. I was on my own. The clock on the wall ticked again, its sound unnervingly loud in the silence. I sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the man to return, or for the voice to whisper again. But there was nothing. Just silence. My head was spinning. What was happening? Was I just imagining everything? Maybe it was just the isolation. Maybe the silence and the darkness were messing with my head. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something was wrong. Something in that house, in those woods, was wrong. I paced back and forth in the living room, trying to make sense of it all. Suddenly, I remembered something. Veronica had mentioned in one of our early messages that the house had an interesting history. She said it had been in her family for generations, but she hadn't gone into detail. I quickly grabbed my laptop, hoping to find some clue. Maybe the cottage had a history I wasn't aware of. I opened a browser and began searching for the house. At first, I couldn't find anything. But then, buried in the middle of a forum about haunted places in North Carolina, I found it. The name of the house, the Old Hollow Grove Cottage. I clicked on the link, my breath catching in my throat as I read the first few sentences. The Old Hollow Grove Cottage has a dark past. Locals speak in hushed tones about the mysterious deaths that have occurred there over the years. The first tragedy took place in 1924, when a family of 4 was found brutally murdered in the house. No one was ever convicted. Then, in 1953, a man was found hanged from the trees in the yard. He had no family, no connections, and his body was discovered just days after the police received an anonymous tip about a strange woman living on the property. No woman was ever found. My heart pounded in my chest. This wasn't just a random cottage. It had a dark history, a history that Veronica hadn't bothered to mention. The more I read, the more I realized that the deaths were not isolated incidents. Every few decades, something horrible happened to the people who stayed in that cottage. I quickly skimmed through more posts, my stomach turning as I read about strange figures seen in the woods, about people hearing whispers in the night, and about disappearances that no one could explain. I couldn't breathe. It all made sense now. The strange man outside. The footsteps. The voice. Everything. I slammed the laptop shut, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I knew I had to leave, but I couldn't. The fear had paralyzed me. That's when I heard it again, the whisper. This time, it wasn't just in my head. It was real. Don't go. I looked toward the staircase, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time louder, sharper, more insistent. Don't go. I spun around, and that's when I saw it, on the floor, by the door, lying face up. A small, old-fashioned key. It wasn't there before. I hadn't seen it when I locked the door earlier. I took a step forward, drawn to it against my better judgment. I bent down and picked it up. It was cold, and the metal felt heavy in my hand. A sudden jolt of realization struck me. This wasn't a regular key. It looked exactly like the one used for the attic. I hadn't seen an attic in the house when I first arrived, but now that I thought about it, there had been a door upstairs that I hadn't checked. The one at the end of the hallway. The air around me seemed to thicken, the weight of the house pressing in on me. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. Don't go, don't go, don't go. I turned, against every instinct telling me to run, and made my way toward the stairs. I climbed the stairs slowly, gripping the key tightly. The darkness of the second floor swallowed me up, the shadows stretching along the walls like fingers trying to pull me in. I reached the end of the hallway, where the attic door stood, locked, just as I remembered it. I slid the key into the lock, and when I turned it, the door creaked open. Inside, it was cold, too cold for a place that had been empty for so long. The attic was dimly lit by a single light bulb that flickered as soon as I stepped in. The room was cluttered with old furniture, dusty boxes, and cobwebs. But there was something else, something that made my stomach churn. The air smelled wrong. It smelled like decay. I stepped further into the attic, and that's when I saw it. On the far wall, there was a large, old-fashioned mirror, its surface cracked and dusty. But what terrified me wasn't the mirror itself, it was the reflection staring back at me. It wasn't mine. A woman stood there, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and dark. She was wearing a faded dress, the fabric torn in places, and her hands were pressed against the glass as if trying to reach through. I staggered backward, horrified. The mirror seemed to pulse, and the whispers were louder now, all around me, closing in. "Don't go." But it was too late. I stood frozen, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I stared at the woman in the mirror. Her face twisted with sorrow, her hollow eyes staring directly into mine as if she knew my every thought, every fear. I wanted to look away, to run, but I couldn't move. The air felt thick, suffocating, as though the room itself was closing in on me. The whispers were louder now, more urgent. "Don't go." The words reverberated inside my skull, like they were coming from every direction at once. I turned my head, trying to locate the source, but there was nothing, only the mirror, the woman, and that cold, oppressive air. I took a step back, my heart pounding. But the woman in the mirror didn't move. Her hands remained pressed against the glass, her expression a twisted mix of fear and longing. It was as though she was begging me to stay, or warning me to leave. I could feel something pulling me toward the mirror. It wasn't just curiosity. It was something far deeper, something primal, like an invisible force was drawing me in. The whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Don't go. Don't go. Don't." The voice stopped abruptly, and the mirror seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. I blinked, trying to comprehend what I was seeing. The surface of the glass distorted, the woman's face warping, as if something was trying to break through. My legs gave out, and I collapsed to my knees, feeling the floor beneath me cold and unyielding. And then, just as suddenly as it began, the rippling stopped. The woman's face was still there, but now it was different. Her eyes were no longer hollow, they were filled with anger, a burning, terrible rage. Her mouth twisted into a silent scream, her body thrashing in the mirror, though her hands still pressed against the glass, as though trying to escape. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking as I tried to push myself away from the mirror. My body was screaming at me to get out, to leave the attic, to never look at that thing again. But the whispers, the cold, the suffocating sense of dread, they wouldn't let me. With a final, desperate effort, I grabbed the nearest object I could find, an old wooden chair, and threw it toward the mirror. The chair slammed into the glass with a loud crash, but instead of shattering, the mirror absorbed the blow, the wood splintering into pieces that vanished as soon as they touched the surface. The woman's scream intensified, the sound piercing my ears, and then something happened that I can't explain. The reflection of the attic, everything in the room, shifted. It was no longer the dusty, cluttered space I had been standing in. The walls were blackened, the floor covered in thick, dark shadows, and the woman in the mirror, she was no longer just a reflection. She was standing right in front of me. I couldn't move. She reached toward me, her fingers curling as if she were going to grab me, pull me through the mirror. Her breath came out in ragged gasps, and I could feel the coldness emanating from her. My whole body froze in terror. This wasn't just a ghost. This wasn't just some cursed mirror. This was something far worse. And then, before I could react, the door to the attic slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart thundering in my chest. The door was locked. There was no way out. I rushed to the window, but it was as if the room itself had changed. The outside world was gone, replaced by an endless void of darkness. There was no sky, no trees, no land. Just a black emptiness that stretched on forever. The woman's voice now joined the whispers, louder and clearer. "You shouldn't have come here. You should never have come." I turned to face her, my body trembling. Her eyes were wide with fury now, her once pale face twisted into a grotesque, contorted mask of hatred. Her lips moved in silent words, her gaze fixated on me as if she were condemning me. With a final, horrific scream, she lunged toward me, her hands outstretched, her fingers stretching far longer than they should. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't move. And then, just as she was about to touch me, the world around me shifted again. I was back in the attic, standing in front of the mirror. The air was still, the room quiet. The woman was gone. The darkness was gone. But I knew, somehow, that this wasn't over. I had seen the truth. I had seen what was behind that mirror, and it wasn't something I could escape from. My body felt heavy, drained, as if the very life had been sucked from me. I stumbled toward the door, desperate to get out, but it didn't open. The handle wouldn't turn. I was trapped. I slammed my shoulder against the door, again and again, but it wouldn't budge. The house, the cottage, was alive, alive in a way I couldn't understand. It had claimed me, just as it had claimed so many before me. I pulled at the window, trying to force it open, but the darkness outside was still there, pressing in. There was nowhere to go. The whispers returned, low and insistent. "Don't go. You belong here now." And then, a voice, this time, Veronica's voice, came from behind me. "I told you not to leave," she whispered. I spun around, my heart in my throat. Veronica was standing in the doorway. But her eyes were empty, hollow, just like the woman in the mirror. And I realized too late, I hadn't come here to escape. I had come here to become part of it. The room was closing in on me again. Veronica's presence in the doorway felt like a weight pressing on my chest, as if she were the final barrier between me and the truth. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were glued to the floor, my legs refusing to move. The whispers were louder now, as if they were coming from the walls themselves. "You belong here now." Her eyes were empty, just black voids where there should have been pupils. I could feel her gaze on me, suffocating me, pulling me into a dark place I didn't understand. Her mouth moved, but no sound came out. Her lips twitched in a smile, but it wasn't a smile. It was something darker. "I told you not to leave," Veronica repeated, her voice hollow and distant, like an echo from another world. I tried to back away, but the air around me thickened, like something was physically holding me in place. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle once again, but it was useless. No matter how hard I turned it, the door wouldn't open. I was trapped in this nightmarish place, and the realization hit me harder than a physical blow. There was no escape. What is this? What have you done to me?" I gasped, my voice barely a whisper, barely audible over the cacophony of the voices in the walls. Veronica didn't answer. She only stared, her expression unnerving, cold. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch toward her like tendrils, consuming the space around us. Slowly, almost deliberately, she stepped forward, and with each step, the temperature in the room dropped, her presence growing heavier. I felt a chill slide down my spine as if the house itself was trying to crawl into my skin. The cold became unbearable, the air thick with an oppressive weight. And then I saw it, the wall behind Veronica, the one closest to the mirror, began to shift. It rippled, like liquid, as if the very fabric of the room were being torn apart. Something was coming through. "No," I gasped. "No, no, no." I stumbled backward, tripping over the floorboards, panic clawing at me. The room felt like it was shrinking, the shadows closing in, but I couldn't turn away. I couldn't look away. And then I saw her. The woman. The one from the mirror. She wasn't just in the reflection anymore. She was standing behind Veronica, her face twisted in agony, her body flickering like a broken shadow. Her skin was pale and cracked, her hands twisted into claws that reached out toward me, her eyes black pools of emptiness. Her mouth opened wide, but no sound came from her lips, just an unholy, silent scream. I felt the coldness seep into my bones. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw something in them, something familiar. She wasn't just a ghost. She was something worse, something that had been waiting, something that had been trapped in this house for too long, just like me. Veronica turned toward the woman, her face still vacant, her eyes hollow, and spoke, but her voice wasn't hers anymore. It was deep, raspy, otherworldly. "You were never meant to leave," the voice said. The floorboards groaned beneath my feet as the woman in the corner lurched forward, her figure distorting unnaturally, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. A low, guttural sound filled the room, and my heart nearly stopped. The air itself felt like it was alive, like the walls were breathing, drawing me into them. "I don't understand," I gasped, my voice breaking with fear. "What do you want from me? What do you want?" Veronica's lips twisted into a cruel smile, but the smile wasn't hers. It was the woman's smile, the one who had been trapped in the mirror. It was the same tortured expression I had seen reflected in that glass. The same longing. "To be free," the voice said, its tone shifting like the wind. I understood in that moment what had happened. What this house was. This cottage wasn't just haunted by spirits. It was a prison, a tomb for those who dared enter, a place that fed on the souls of the curious and the lost. And now, I was part of it. Part of the house. Part of the curse. "Help me," I whispered, the tears falling freely now. "Please, help me." But no one was coming to help me. The woman from the mirror reached out, her hand stretching toward me with a horrifying grace. She was no longer a reflection. She was here, and she was ready to claim me. The floor beneath me cracked, a deep fissure forming in the wood as the room seemed to break apart. The walls themselves seemed to pulse with life, breathing in and out, alive with a hunger I couldn't escape. Veronica stepped aside, her body almost melding with the shadows now, her presence fading. The woman reached for me, and I knew in that moment that this was it. There was no way out. No hope. I had been brought here, and I was going to be part of this dark, twisted history. There was no running from the past, no escaping the house that was already pulling me into its depths. And then, the darkness closed in. The darkness wrapped itself around me like a heavy blanket, suffocating in cold. My chest tightened, and I struggled to breathe, but the air seemed to thicken with every passing second, pressing in on me from all sides. The woman, she, was just inches away now. Her hands, cold and clammy, reached out with terrifying precision, her fingers twisted in a way that wasn't human, as though they were stretching to claim me. I closed my eyes, desperately trying to escape her touch, but it was no use. The house, the very walls of the cottage, were alive, pulling me toward her. The floor beneath my feet trembled, and I could hear a distant, rumbling sound that grew louder by the second, like the earth itself was about to swallow me whole. The woman's voice, hollow and cold, filled my mind again, an echo of something lost in time. "You are part of us now. You will never leave. No one does." My heart thundered in my chest as I fought to free myself, but the shadows seemed to hold me in place, tightening around my limbs with an unnatural force. The woman's figure flickered in and out of view, a ghostly blur, but every time I opened my eyes, she was closer. I could feel her breath on my skin, cold as death itself. Suddenly, I felt a pull in my chest, a deep, magnetic force that seemed to draw me toward the center of the room, as though I were being called. My body moved against my will, my feet dragging me to the center of the attic. The mirror, that cursed mirror, was now glowing, an unnatural light emanating from its cracked surface. I tried to scream, to run, but my voice was gone, stolen by the oppressive force that surrounded me. The woman was standing directly in front of the mirror now, her face twisted in agony, her mouth open in a silent scream. I saw the reflection of my own eyes in the glass, wide with terror, filled with tears, but I wasn't alone. Behind me, Veronica's hollow gaze watched me silently, her face still frozen in that eerie, empty smile. This is it, I thought to myself. This is the end. But then, something inside me snapped. I couldn't die here. I wouldn't let this cursed house claim me like it had claimed so many others before me. I looked around frantically, searching for anything at all, that could help me. In that instant, I saw it. The key. The key I had found earlier, lying on the floor by the door. It was still in my hand, its cold metal burning against my skin. It was the key to the attic, I realized. But what if it was something else? The mirror. The key. What if I could escape? Without thinking, I lunged forward, pushing myself toward the mirror with a surge of adrenaline. The woman's hands reached out, her fingers grazing my skin, and I felt a cold, numbing sensation spread through my body. But I wasn't stopping. I couldn't. I held the key tightly in my hand, and as I reached the mirror, I thrust it forward, slamming the metal against the glass. The mirror rippled like water, the reflection warping and distorting. The woman screamed, her face splitting into a grotesque smile, and the shadows in the room howled in fury. No, she screamed, her voice distorted. You cannot leave. But I didn't care. I jammed the key into the crack in the mirror and turned it. There was a deafening crack. A violent jolt that shook the very foundation of the house. The room seemed to collapse in on itself, the walls crumbling, the ceiling buckling as the house itself screamed in protest. But the mirror, the cursed mirror, began to shatter, piece by piece, the glass splintering into jagged shards that flew across the room. The woman's face twisted in agony, but as the last shard of the mirror fell to the ground, she vanished. The oppressive weight in the room lifted, the shadows receding into nothingness. And just like that, everything went quiet. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, my heart racing. The room was dark again, but it was no longer the suffocating darkness it had been before. I could breathe. The cold was gone. I looked around. Veronica was gone. The house was still. The attic was empty. But there was a strange silence now, a silence that was almost too quiet. I wasn't sure if I had won, if I had escaped, or if this was some new trick the house had in store for me. I couldn't stay. I knew that much. I had to leave, but I didn't know if I was really free. Was the house done with me, or would it claim me once again? I ran down the stairs, my legs weak but determined. The door was unlocked. I flung it open and stepped into the night, gasping for breath as I crossed the threshold. I kept running, not looking back, not daring to. The woods around me were still, silent. I didn't know if I would ever feel safe again. But I made it out. At least, that's what I thought. I didn't know that the house, the mirror, and the curse had followed me, hidden in the shadows of my mind. It wasn't just the house I had escaped. It was something worse. And it would never let me go. It's been weeks since I left the cottage. The air in the woods, the house, the mirror, it all feels like a distant nightmare now, something that should have stayed buried in the past. But deep down, I know the truth. No matter how far I run, no matter how much I try to forget, it's still with me. I've tried everything. I've visited doctors, therapists, even tried hypnosis, hoping to rid myself of the haunting memories. But nothing works. No matter where I go, I feel that cold presence lurking behind me, whispering from the shadows. The nightmares never stop. They're worse now, because they don't just happen when I sleep. They're with me, during the day, when I'm driving, when I'm in the shower, when I'm alone in a room. I can hear the whispers in my ear, you belong here now. You will never escape. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more real it became. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the feeling of hands on my shoulders, the touch of something cold and clammy, crawling through my skin. Sometimes, I swear I hear someone breathing behind me, but when I turn around, there's no one there. But then, last night, it happened. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The quiet of the apartment felt suffocating. And then, I heard it, the whisper. I froze, the blood draining from my face. This time, it wasn't in my head. I could hear it, clearly, as if someone were standing right next to me. You can't escape. I jumped out of bed, my heart racing, looking around the room, but no one was there. I told myself it was just my imagination, just my mind finally cracking under the pressure of the trauma. But then, my eyes fell on the mirror. I hadn't noticed it before, but there it was, sitting on the wall across from my bed, where there had never been a mirror before. It was old, cracked, the edges jagged and chipped. A large antique frame encased it, the glass dirty with a layer of dust. I could feel the air grow heavier, colder. And then I saw it. In the reflection, standing behind me, was her. The woman. The one from the mirror at the cottage. Her eyes were wide, empty, staring at me with that same tortured expression. Her fingers reached toward me through the glass, her form flickering, as if the glass itself was trying to suck her back in. I screamed, backing away from the mirror. My chest felt tight, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. I grabbed my phone, hands trembling as I dialed the first number that came to mind, my friend Mark. He answered after a few rings, sounding groggy. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked. Mark, I need you to come over. Please." I barely recognized my own voice, it was so shaky. Okay. What's going on?" Just hurry," I said, hanging up. I turned back to the mirror. The woman was still there, but now she was moving closer, her face pressed against the glass, her mouth opening in a silent scream. The air grew colder still, and the whispers, they were louder, more frantic. "You can't leave. You will never leave. You belong here." I turned away from the mirror, running to the door. But before I could even touch the handle, the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. I spun around, my body going cold. The reflection in the mirror had changed. It wasn't just her anymore. I saw myself in the glass too, standing there, eyes wide with terror, just like the others. I saw Mark's face reflected beside mine, his eyes frozen in fear. But we weren't the only ones there. The woman's figure was joined by others, figures that emerged from the glass, shadows that reached out with twisted, skeletal hands, pulling themselves through the mirror. Faces I didn't recognize, twisted in agony, bodies that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. They were all there, surrounding me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin. And that's when I realized, it wasn't just the house that had trapped me. It was the mirror. The house had fed off the souls of those who dared enter, and it had kept their spirits imprisoned for years. But the mirror, it was something else. It was the doorway, the passage that connected the lost souls to the world of the living. And now, it wanted me. It wanted all of us. Mark never showed up. I don't know if he ever will. No one will. There's no escape. I've tried to leave again, but the mirror keeps me here. The glass pulls me back every time, like it has a life of its own. I don't know how much time has passed since that night. Days? Weeks? It's all the same. The darkness is endless, and I'm trapped in this house, in this mirror, just like the others before me. But I know one thing for sure, I'll never be free. The house will never let me go. And it will never let you go, either. You see, the curse doesn't stop here. Once it finds you, it follows you. And one day, when you least expect it, it will find you too. And you will join us in the mirror.